She was born beneath gilded ceilings, where destiny spoke louder than love. Maria of Austria, daughter of Emperor Ferdinand I, was raised to embody perfection, fluent, graceful, obedient. But in the shadows of her polished world, her mind began to unravel. Her crown became a cage, her prayers turned into echoes. And when her voice finally fell silent, even history chose not to listen. Maria of Austria was born on May 15, 1531, within the fortress palace of Prague Castle. A world of marbled corridors, painted ceilings, and the scent of incense that lingered after every royal mass. She entered life as part of Europe's most powerful dynasty, the House of Habsburg, a name that ruled not just lands, but the very rhythm of the continent's wars and peace treaties. Her father, Ferdinand I, was the Holy Roman Emperor, a man of order and piety who saw politics as divine architecture. Her mother, Anna of Bohemia and Hungary, carried the inheritance of ancient kings who had once ruled from Buda and Prague. From birth, Maria's destiny was not her own. It had been written for her centuries before she ever breathed. The court around her spoke in many tongues: Latin for prayers, German for governance, Spanish for diplomacy, and Italian for music. Tutors praised her intelligence and grace, but often noted a shadow that lingered in her demeanor. "She is delicate," one wrote, "and tends to contemplation more than joy." That softness, rare in a family defined by its iron will, would become both her distinction and her curse. In the portraits painted of her youth, Maria's eyes appear distant, her expression restrained. She looked like a girl trained not to smile too widely, lest the crown slip from her brow before she ever wore it. The education of a Habsburg daughter was never meant to cultivate freedom, only perfection. Maria studied languages, theology, dance, embroidery, and diplomacy. Her brothers learned to rule. She learned to obey. But she absorbed more than she was taught. She listened to the confessions whispered in corridors, stories of arranged marriages, broken alliances, and royal women sent away to convents when they failed to produce heirs. She learned early that silence was the first lesson of power. To speak out of turn was to invite ruin. Her father, Ferdinand, adored his children, but ruled them with the same discipline he imposed on his empire. His faith was absolute, his sense of duty unbending. When he looked at Maria, he did not see a child, but a link in the divine chain that bound Habsburg destiny to the Church of Rome. He once wrote that his daughters should live as vessels of virtue, for they are born not for themselves, but for Christ and the empire. Maria internalized that creed as truth. Yet somewhere within her, a quiet resistance began to grow. Her mother, Anna, died when Maria was still young, leaving a wound that never healed. The loss of maternal affection in a world of cold ceremony shaped her profoundly. While other princesses learned charm, Maria learned solitude. She retreated into study and prayer, often spending hours in the chapel beneath Prague Castle, whispering psalms in Latin to no one but God. Even then, she was described as pale and thoughtful, with an unsteady spirit that trembles under divine contemplation. The court saw it as piety. In truth, it was loneliness disguised as faith. The Habsburgs believed in the sanctity of blood, but that belief came with its own shadows. Centuries of intermarriage among royal cousins had strengthened their empire, but weakened their bodies and minds. Chronic illness, deformity, and melancholia were whispered legacies of the family name. Maria inherited the Habsburg jaw and the Habsburg temperament, proud, devout, and painfully introspective. Her fragility was not just physical, it was hereditary. And like many women of her line, she bore it in silence. For weakness in a royal woman was not an ailment, it was a sin. The 1530s were years of upheaval. The Reformation was tearing through Europe, shattering faith and politics alike. The Habsburgs, devout defenders of the old order, faced rebellion across their lands. Maria grew up in an atmosphere thick with sermons and suspicion. Priests spoke of heresy. Soldiers marched to war in God's name. Even as a child, she learned to see fear behind every cross. To live as a Habsburg was to live under judgment of men, of faith, and of history itself. Yet there were moments of gentleness amid the solemnity. In her letters to her older sister Elizabeth, Maria wrote about music lessons, gardens, and the rare evenings when their father allowed laughter at supper. She loved to play the lute, though she often preferred slow, mournful melodies that her tutors found unsuitable for a child. Her nursemaid once remarked that the little Archduchess smiles only when the candles are lit for vespers. It was as though her spirit belonged to the dusk, half in this world, half in another. In the years before her arranged marriage, Maria's beauty was described as modest. Fair, slight, and composed, one diplomat wrote. But it was her serenity that impressed most observers. She seemed carved from marble, untouchable and restrained. Yet beneath that composure lay the earliest tremors of unease. Witnesses would later recall how she sometimes froze mid-conversation, as if listening to voices no one else could hear. These were dismissed as distractions, girlish sensitivities. But for Maria, they were the beginnings of a descent that history would one day call madness. Her childhood ended as all royal childhoods did, not with freedom, but with negotiation. By the time she turned 15, envoys were already sent to arrange her marriage. The girl who once played hymns in candlelight was now a political token, a vessel for alliances. Her father's scribes began drafting letters to the court of William of Jülich-Klevesburg, describing her virtues in the same language they used for dowries and treaties: pure, obedient, and fruitful. In the chronicles of empire, Maria of Austria appeared only as a name beneath a date. Yet behind that name was a young woman already bearing the weight of generations. She was a daughter of power, molded by faith and hollowed by expectation. The walls of Prague Castle had raised her, and already they had begun to close in. At 15, Maria of Austria's name was inked not in love, but in law. Her future was sealed by men she barely knew, sitting around a table heavy with wax seals and golden pens. The Habsburg dynasty, ever calculating, ever cautious, had chosen her to be the living bridge between Imperial Vienna and the Rhineland Duchy of Jülich-Klevesburg. The alliance was meant to fortify Catholic influence in a region trembling under the shockwaves of the Reformation. But for Maria, it meant exile from the familiar marble corridors of Prague to a land of cold stone, gray skies, and strangers who spoke in rougher tones. Her groom, William the Rich, was Duke of Jülich-Klevesburg, 40 years old when Maria was still barely 16. He was a man of contrasts, known for his wealth, diplomacy, and appetite for pleasure. His first marriage, to Joan of Navarre, had been annulled years earlier, though the reasons remained wrapped in ambiguity, an annulment Maria would later come to obsess over. The alliance seemed perfect on parchment, her noble blood for his territorial strength. But every alliance has a price, and Maria was that price. The wedding took place in 1546, under vaulted ceilings shimmering with tapestries and candlelight. Chroniclers wrote of the procession with almost mechanical reverence. The silks, the choirs, the Latin blessings that echoed through the cathedral of Düsseldorf. Yet one account, buried in a lesser-known diary, offered a different image. The bride sat pale, her lips unmoving even when the vows were spoken. The people murmured she had not understood the words, or perhaps she understood too well. As the ceremony concluded and the bells pealed across the Rhine, Maria's fate was sealed more tightly than the marriage rings that bound her. The fireworks that celebrated the union burned bright above the castle walls that would soon hold her captive in silence. The first weeks of her life in Jülich-Klevsburg were a pageant of introductions and duties. Courtiers bowed, priests blessed, and diplomats toasted her as Her Grace, the Austrian Rose. But the Duke's affection was formal, almost performative. He treated her with courtesy, but not with warmth. When the guests departed and the music faded, Maria found herself surrounded by courtiers who regarded her not as a duchess, but as an emissary of Vienna, a foreigner with too much faith and too little familiarity with their customs. She wrote to her sister Elizabeth, "Here, all things are strange, and I am as a statue among voices." Those letters, preserved only in fragments, speak of her longing for home, her unease with the new court, and her growing fear of divine scrutiny. In one haunting line, she confided, "I am not sure if God watches over me or through me." William's political focus lay on maintaining balance between Catholic and Protestant factions within his duchy. He traveled frequently, to Brussels, to Cologne, to Cleves, leaving Maria alone for months in echoing halls filled with servants who spoke low German she barely understood. Isolation became her daily bread. Her attendants noticed she often prayed through the night, sometimes weeping without sound, the rosary beads slipping through her trembling fingers until dawn. The courtiers began to whisper that the new duchess was too holy, too severe, too strange. But what they called piety may have been fear, fear of error, fear of sin, fear that even one wrong thought could damn her. The world of a 16th century Catholic woman was shaped by confession and control. For Maria, both became chains she could neither bear nor break. She found little comfort in her husband. William, pragmatic and worldly, valued alliances more than affection. He maintained cordial relations with her family, but his heart belonged to the shifting politics of the Reformation era. To him, Maria was a guarantee, a living insurance policy against imperial wrath. His mistresses, though discreet, were not invisible. Maria knew of them, and each unspoken betrayal deepened her retreat inward. The Duke's courtiers entertained themselves with gossip. They laughed at her accent, her devotion, her preference for solitude. They mimicked the way she crossed herself before every meal. But their cruelty was not unique. It was the casual mockery of a court that measured worth in charm, wit, and fecundity. And Maria, in her pale stillness, offered none. The marriage bed produced heirs, but not companionship. Between pregnancies, she fell into spells of exhaustion and trembling. The court physicians recommended pilgrimages and relics. The confessor prescribed repentance. And William, growing weary of his wife's fragility, withdrew further into business and diplomacy. Her anxieties deepened when rumors resurfaced about William's first marriage. Some whispered that his annulment had been political, not spiritual. Others claimed that Joan of Navarre still lived, and that Maria's union, in God's eyes, might be void. For a devout Habsburg daughter, raised to believe marriage was sacred and indissoluble, this was no mere scandal. It was blasphemy. She began to fear that she was living in sin, that her children were illegitimate, that every prayer she spoke reached a heaven closed to her. That thought became her slow undoing. She started refusing communion, terrified that unworthiness might bring her eternal damnation. Her confessor wrote to Vienna expressing concern. The Duchess is haunted by the notion of divine displeasure. She trembles even in sunlight. The year 1548 brought a rare visit from her brother, Archduke Maximilian, who would later become emperor. He found her withdrawn, thin, her once steady gaze unmoored. She greeted him with formality but little recognition. After their meeting, Maximilian confided to an aide that, "Our sister seems touched by an invisible affliction, one the physicians cannot treat." The court dismissed it as melancholy, a common term for every sorrow they could not name. But melancholy in the 16th century was not a poetic condition. It was a death sentence of the mind. As the years passed, Maria became less visible. The banquets continued without her. Her name appeared less frequently in state records. She still performed her duties when summoned, attending masses, presenting herself at festivals, sitting beside William at processions. But her eyes no longer followed the crowds. She seemed to drift between presence and absence, as though her soul had already begun its quiet retreat from the living world. In the end, Maria's marriage achieved its purpose. The alliance between Vienna and the Rhineland held steady. The duchy remained prosperous, and the Habsburg influence endured. But within the walls of Düsseldorf, one woman had become a ghost of her own making, a duchess bound not by love, but by parchment. And as she knelt before the altar each morning, lips moving in silent prayer, she could not shake the question that would torment her for the rest of her life. Had God blessed her marriage or condemned it? The court of Jülich-Klevsburg was nothing like the glittering halls Maria had known in her youth. Prague and Vienna had been filled with ceremony, music, and the murmur of scholars debating beneath frescoed ceilings. But in Düsseldorf, the rhythm of court life was smaller, heavier, provincial. The courtiers were pragmatic men, concerned with land disputes, taxes, and the religious balance that threatened to tear their duchy apart. To them, the new duchess was not a partner in governance, but a distant ornament, an outsider who prayed too much and spoke too softly. Maria's arrival had been greeted with curiosity rather than affection. The nobility of the Rhineland respected her bloodline, but not her temperament. They found her too austere for their feasts, too silent at their gatherings, too foreign in her ways. The Habsburg formality that had shaped her, the careful gestures, the ritualized speech, the endless bows and curtsies, felt suffocatingly cold to the more earthy German lords. And for Maria, who had been raised among theologians and courtiers who spoke Latin and Spanish, their dialects sounded coarse, almost barbaric. The divide between them was more than language. It was atmosphere. Her husband William, though courteous, offered little solace. He was often away, negotiating with Protestant princes, attending imperial diets, or managing the fractious territories under his control. When he did return, his presence brought anxiety rather than comfort. He demanded composure, obedience, and the appearance of serenity. All things Maria struggled to maintain. The few evenings they spent together were awkward rituals, filled with long silences and the rustle of fine clothing. He preferred the company of his advisors or his falcons, or the women who required less patience. In the great halls of the ducal palace, Maria's footsteps echoed too loudly. She filled her hours with embroidery, music, and prayer, yet none of these brought peace. She missed her sisters, Magdalena, Margaret, and Elizabeth, who had all been married off to distant lands, each fulfilling her duty like beads scattered from the same rosary. letters arrived from Vienna with formal greetings and distant concern. "You are in our prayers," Ferdinand wrote, but never once did he visit. In the Habsburg world, affection was measured in alliances, not embraces. Maria's attendants, most of them local women, found her unsettling. She spoke little, often staring into the distance mid-conversation, her hands resting motionless on her lap. When addressed, she would answer in German tinged with the cadence of Vienna, precise, deliberate, as if translating her own thoughts into a language that no longer belonged to her. Some days she seemed alert, even gracious. Others she would withdraw into silence so deep that her maids whispered she was speaking to angels. There are fragments of reports, letters written by visiting envoys, household records, servants' testimonies preserved in church archives. From these shards, historians have pieced together a portrait of a woman gradually retreating from the world. One described her as melancholic and slow of speech, yet sometimes burning with strange zeal. Another noted that she spent hours kneeling before the same crucifix, murmuring Latin prayers until her voice cracked. The confessor who attended her grew alarmed, writing privately to Vienna that her grace is seized by fears of judgment, as though her soul were condemned. Religion, once her refuge, had begun to torment her. Maria's devotion was absolute, but so was her fear of imperfection. Every sermon on sin, every confession, every reminder of the day of reckoning fed the shadows in her mind. She began fasting for days, claiming that food burdened her soul. She slept on the floor beside her bed to imitate the suffering of saints. Yet none of it brought peace, only deeper exhaustion. The loneliness of her position compounded her fragility. Court banquets continued without her. Tournaments and celebrations were held in her absence. The Duke's mistresses were discreetly acknowledged, and their presence, though never spoken of, was felt in the laughter that returned to the palace only when Maria was ill. In time, even her servants began to avoid her chambers after dusk, claiming that strange sounds, whispers, footsteps, sighs, drifted from behind her door when she was alone. Maria's isolation was not just emotional, it was architectural. The ducal palace itself was vast and echoing, its corridors lit by wavering torches that threw long shadows across frescoed walls. She often wandered the galleries at night, clutching her rosary, her reflection flickering in the darkened windows. It is said that one night she stopped before a mirror and covered it with a veil, declaring that the glass speaks lies. From then on, every mirror in her apartments was shrouded in black cloth. Letters from this period, written by the Duke's counselors, describe her condition with a mix of pity and embarrassment. Her grace is delicate of mind, one wrote, and must not be taxed with matters of governance. Another suggested sending her to a convent for peace and prayer. But William resisted, not out of love, but out of calculation. To confine his duchess would be to invite scandal, and scandal weakened power. So Maria remained where she was, not imprisoned, yet not free. Her sense of self began to erode. The roles assigned to her, wife, duchess, mother, no longer felt distinct. She wrote once to her confessor, "I am a vessel without shape. I carry the name of Austria, but no longer know who speaks when I pray." The line, preserved in an ecclesiastical archive, reads less like theology than a cry from the edge of consciousness. When visitors from Vienna came in 1550, they reported that the Duchess looked frail and transparent, as if light might pass through her. They found her sitting by a window overlooking the Rhine, tracing the movements of passing ships with her finger. She asked them quietly if the river led home. By then, rumors of her instability had reached the imperial court. But the Habsburgs, burdened with wars and diplomacy, could spare no attention for a daughter gone astray. Madness, after all, was not a scandal unique to her. It was a family affliction best ignored. In the evenings, the bells of St. Lambert's Church echoed through Dusseldorf. The sound carried across the river, fading into the forested hills beyond. The servant said that when the bells rang, Maria would close her eyes and whisper, "They are calling for me." She was not yet lost, but the descent had begun. What began as melancholy was hardening into something more, a slow, solemn collapse of reason, gilded by prayer and wrapped in silence. In the lonely court of Jülich-Cleves-Berg, the Duchess of Austria had become a ghost in her own lifetime, walking through corridors that neither loved nor remembered her. By the late 1550s, the whispers around the ducal palace had shifted from curiosity to fear. What had once been dismissed as melancholy was now spoken of as madness, though few dared to use the word aloud. The courtiers referred to her instead as unwell, fragile, mystically afflicted. They avoided her eyes when she passed through the halls, her steps soft as the hush that followed. Maria of Austria had begun to slip into a twilight between faith and delirium, her mind haunted by visions that even her confessors could not exorcise. The transformation was not sudden. It had crept upon her quietly, a gradual unthreading of thought, a dissolving of the borders between prayer and obsession. Her life had become a ritual of repetitions. Each morning she rose before dawn to kneel before her crucifix, whispering the same verses until her voice trembled and failed. Each evening, she paced her chambers, counting her rosary beads again and again, as though the act itself might rebuild order in her disordered mind. Witnesses recorded that she began to see shapes in the flicker of candles, shadows that moved when no one else was near. At first, she described them as angels, then as spirits, then as voices from within. When her attendants tried to comfort her, she accused them of deception, that they sought to draw her away from God's truth. She stopped trusting those closest to her. Even her confessor's presence filled her with dread, as if every question he asked were an accusation. The Duke, still occupied with his realm's politics, visited rarely. When he did, he found her alternately serene and frantic. There were nights when she received him with the calm of a saint, her eyes luminous, her speech composed. Yet by morning she might be trembling in terror, convinced that he was an impostor or that their marriage was cursed. One physician, summoned in secrecy, wrote that her Grace's faculties are undone by divine fear. She believes herself already among the damned. That fear, rooted in faith, became her undoing. Ever since she had learned of William's previous marriage to Joan of Navarre, Maria's conscience had been infected with doubt. Was their union valid in the eyes of God? Were her children legitimate? In an age when salvation depended on the purity of one's soul, such uncertainty was not merely emotional, it was existential. To a Habsburg princess raised in the strictest Catholic doctrine, sin was not an act, but a condition, and doubt itself was sin. She began to confess endlessly, seeking absolution she could not accept. "I am unclean in my vows," she told her confessor, "for my husband's past is my eternal stain." No reassurance could calm her. When he insisted that the annulment had been lawful, she accused him of lying on God's behalf. The chaplains debated whether her condition was possession or madness. Both explanations terrified them. She avoided mirrors entirely, claiming they showed not her face, but her soul. Servants were forbidden to place polished metal or glass near her. Once, when a maid accidentally left a silver basin uncovered, Maria screamed so violently that she fainted. Upon waking, she demanded that all mirrors in her chamber be draped in black cloth so that Satan might not look back. In her rare lucid moments, she wrote letters, fragments of which survive, filled with incoherent theology and longing. One passage reads, "The Lord hides himself from me, for my prayers sound like blasphemy. I feel him not in the host, but in the silence that follows." Her handwriting faltered toward the end, slanting downward as though the page itself were too heavy to carry her thoughts. Her decline mirrored the age around her. Europe was fracturing between faiths. Princes and priests alike claimed divine favor while slaughtering each other in its name. Within her mind, the same war raged, between obedience and doubt, devotion and despair. She had been raised to see the church as a fortress. Yet within those very walls, she felt pursued by unseen judgment. Rumors spread that the Duchess was possessed. A priest performed minor rites of exorcism, sprinkling her chambers with holy water, hanging relics above her bed. But nothing changed. When asked whether she saw demons, she answered softly, "No, only myself." The Duke's patience waned. He ordered that she be attended by fewer servants, claiming privacy was healthier for her spirit. In truth, it was easier to hide her instability from visiting dignitaries. Maria was gradually confined to the upper rooms of the palace, where heavy curtains shut out the light. Her meals were left outside her door. Sometimes she ate, often she did not. Her chambermaids reported hearing her weeping late into the night, a sound described as not loud but endless. By now, the courtiers treated her as an absence. Her name no longer appeared beside the Duke's in decrees. She was replaced at feasts by one of his nieces, who performed the role of Duchess with practiced grace. Even the portraits of Maria, once displayed proudly, were quietly removed. There was one visitor who left a striking record, a Jesuit scholar traveling through the duchy in 1560. He wrote, "Her Grace sits by the fire, thin as a reed. She speaks little but smiles strangely, as if remembering something holy that none of us can see. Her eyes follow corners, not people." The Duke sent reports to Vienna, but the Habsburgs answered only with courtesy and prayer. They offered no intervention. A daughter's madness was a private grief, not a public matter. To admit it would be to expose weakness in a dynasty that claimed divine order itself. As months turned into years, Maria's speech became a stream of prayers, half Latin, half murmur. She sometimes referred to herself in the third person, the sinner Duchess, the unblessed wife. When storms passed over the Rhine, she believed they were heavenly punishments for her sins. Servants claimed she once stood at her window through a thunderstorm, whispering, "Strike me, and let my children be spared." In time, exhaustion dulled her visions. The hysteria softened into silence. But the silence was worse. She sat for hours unmoving, eyes fixed on the crucifix above her bed. When attendants asked if she wished to eat, she only nodded once and returned to stillness. The light of her mind, once flickering, now glowed faintly like a candle nearing its end. And so the Duchess of Austria, once a symbol of alliance and faith, faded into the half-life of her own devotion, trapped between guilt and grace. In an age that saw madness as moral failure, no one asked whether her illness was born not of sin, but of solitude. The world beyond her curtained windows went on, reformations, wars, coronations, while Maria remained in her fortress of whispers, where even God's voice had become a rumor. In the silent corridors of Dusseldorf Palace, the sound of childbirth was one of the few reminders that Maria of Austria still belonged to the world of the living. Between her late teens and mid-30s, she endured 7 pregnancies, each one taking more of her body, more of her mind, and more of her will. The Habsburg daughters were trained from infancy to see motherhood not as joy, but as duty. To produce heirs was the most sacred form of obedience. Yet for Maria, every birth was both a triumph and a wound, a passage through pain that left her weaker, thinner, quieter. The first child came too soon after marriage, a son, frail and short-lived. The infant died within months, wrapped in silk and buried under the chapel floor. A second son followed years later, John William, who survived but grew into the same restless fragility that haunted his mother. The rest were daughters, each beautiful, each doomed to become a pawn in the same web of treaties that had ensnared Maria herself. The physicians of the court praised her piety, her willingness to suffer in silence. They called her a model of Christian womanhood, for she neither screamed nor resisted during labor. But the servants, those who saw the aftermath, spoke of the hollow look in her eyes after each confinement, a gaze that drifted to the corners of the ceiling as if searching for someone unseen. After her 4th child, Maria stopped playing the lute. After her 5th, she rarely spoke at meals. Her body had become a vessel for lineage, her spirit an afterthought. The Duke, satisfied that his dynasty was secured, turned his attention entirely to affairs of state. He visited her chambers less and less, sometimes only to present her at public events, where she appeared pale and distant beside him, a living emblem rather than a companion. Pregnancy in the 16th century was a battlefield. There was no safety, no certainty. The midwives whispered prayers as much as instructions, invoking the Virgin Mary while preparing herbs and hot water. Each delivery could mean salvation or death. Maria endured them all with an eerie calmness that terrified those around her. One attendant recorded that, after a difficult birth, she lay still for hours, refusing food and saying only, "The soul is heavier than the body." The court doctors prescribed tonics, wine infused with herbs, mercury salts, powders made from crushed pearls, remedies that were as poisonous as they were prestigious. When her melancholy deepened after the deaths of 2 infants, a confessor advised her to seek penance rather than medicine. "Your suffering," he said, "is God's refinement of your virtue." The phrase, meant to console, became a curse. Maria began to believe her pain had purpose, that every ache was a divine message, every loss a test of faith. The role of motherhood did not heal her isolation, it magnified it. Her daughters were raised by governesses, instructed in languages and etiquette, preparing to serve the same machinery of alliances that had consumed their mother. They rarely saw her except during public masses. When they did, they found a woman draped in black veils, her hands clasped so tightly, the knuckles blanched white. The younger ones whispered that their mother was a ghost who prays. In her few letters from this period, Maria's handwriting had changed. Once elegant, now uneven, and pressed too hard into the paper, as though each word required physical struggle. She wrote to her sister Margaret, "The Lord grants me children, then takes them as if to remind me that nothing is mine." Later she added, "When I sleep, I see their faces, but they do not see me." Motherhood, which should have anchored her to life, instead deepened her descent into solitude. She began avoiding social gatherings altogether, claiming illness, Some days she locked herself in her oratory, fasting for days, reciting psalms until her voice broke into whispers. On those nights, the servants said, the candlelight in her chamber burned until dawn. They feared to enter, saying the air felt as if the angels mourned inside. Her relationship with her surviving son, John William, was complex and tragic. He was the heir she had been expected to produce, strong, intelligent, and promising. Yet from childhood, he too displayed sudden fits of rage and confusion, long silences followed by bursts of fervent prayer. He is his mother's son, one courtier murmured, and that is both blessing and curse. The pattern of instability that haunted Maria would later consume him, repeating the same torment in the next generation. By the 1560s, Maria's health had deteriorated visibly. Her face was thin, her frame fragile, her complexion described as white as wax. The court physicians declared her heart weak, her blood chilled by spiritual melancholy. In truth, her illness was not of the body, but of the soul. The slow corrosion of a woman who had been used as a vessel of dynasty rather than allowed to exist as herself. Her confessor urged her to find peace through submission. God sees your obedience, he told her. He will reward it in heaven. But heaven had become, for Maria, a place of uncertainty, another chamber of judgment where she feared to enter. If God is love, she once whispered to her maid, then why does he keep taking everything I love? Her attendants learned to recognize the signs of her despair, the trembling hands, the long pauses between breaths, the blank stare fixed on the crucifix above her bed. They prayed beside her, fearing that one day she might harm herself in her penitence. Yet Maria's suffering remained quiet, internal. Her agony was not the violent madness of a cursed queen, but the slow erasure of a gentle soul under the weight of expectation. By the time her last child was born, Maria had ceased writing entirely. Her signature disappeared from court documents. Her name appeared only in baptismal records. She had given everything the dynasty required: heirs, alliances, appearances, and in return had been left with nothing but silence. When the midwives carried away the infant from her final confinement, Maria turned her face toward the wall and did not speak for 3 days. The courtiers, whispering outside her chamber, did not yet realize it, but the woman who had once been the radiant daughter of Ferdinand had already begun to fade, not from disease, but from exhaustion. In the dim light of her room, surrounded by rosaries, relics, and portraits of her lost children, Maria whispered what may have been her final prayer of clarity. I have borne life, but it has borne me down. And as her candle flickered, so too did the last glimmers of the spirit that had once shone within the daughter of an empire. By the 1560s, the world outside Maria's shuttered windows was no less tormented than the one within her mind. Across the Rhineland, faith was turning to fury. The Reformation had broken Christendom into rival camps, and Jülich-Klevsburg, poised uneasily between Protestant and Catholic territories, became a crucible of tension. Priests argued with preachers in the same streets. Families were divided at their own dinner tables. Smoke from the printing presses carried the scent of rebellion, and every sermon threatened to ignite revolt. Maria's husband, Duke William, walked a political tightrope. His lands bordered the Protestant states of the north and the Catholic bastions of the south. To survive, he adopted a policy of compromise, outwardly loyal to Rome, yet lenient to reformers when expedient. It was a dangerous balance that pleased no one. The Catholics whispered that he was a traitor to the faith. The Lutherans muttered that he was a papist in disguise. Through it all, Maria remained the one constant emblem of old devotion, the silent duchess who clung to her rosary as if to an anchor in a storm. But within the palace, her steadfastness isolated her even further. The court, mirroring its divided duchy, split into factions. Advisors loyal to Protestant reform resented Maria's influence over the household chapels. The Catholic clergy, meanwhile, saw in her illness a sign of spiritual warfare, proof that Satan had infiltrated even the noblest blood. Each group used her as a symbol for its cause, yet neither sought to understand her suffering. Maria herself no longer understood the quarrels of doctrine that swirled around her. To her, faith had ceased to be debate. It was a plea for survival. Her prayers grew shorter, more desperate. She wrote in one trembling note, "The world is divided, and I am divided with it." Her days followed a pattern of fragile order. At dawn, the bells from the cathedral would reach her window. She would rise, cross herself, and walk barefoot across the cold stone floor to the small chapel adjoining her chamber. There she prayed before an ivory crucifix sent years earlier by her brother Maximilian, a relic once touched by relics of saints. The servant said she could stay there for hours, motionless except for her lips. When she emerged, her face bore the calm of exhaustion rather than peace. In the afternoons, she sometimes joined her daughters for lessons in music or embroidery. For brief moments, she seemed almost whole again, correcting a melody, smoothing a strand of silk, praising a child's stitching. Yet the illusion never lasted. A sudden noise, a shadow at the window, a mispronounced Latin word could send her spiraling into murmurs and trembling. "She fades like wax in heat," one governess wrote. "We cannot hold her to the present." By now, Maria's reputation had become a subject of unease. Visiting nobles observed her behavior with discomfort, reporting back to their courts that the Duchess was a woman both holy and touched. Some saw her as a living saint, a martyr of divine suffering. Others viewed her as a curse on the ducal line. William, increasingly embarrassed, restricted her appearances in public. At processions, she was veiled. At masses, she knelt apart from the congregation. When foreign envoys visited, she was presented briefly, smiling faintly, before being escorted away. Yet despite her exclusion, her presence lingered everywhere. In the prayers whispered by servants, in the caution with which her name was spoken. She had become both invisible and inescapable. Even the Duke, for all his pragmatism, avoided sleeping in the same palace wing where she stayed. He feared her silence more than her words. The duchy itself reflected her fracture. Crops failed in some years, flooding struck in others. Superstition spread. Peasants began muttering that the Duchess's sorrow had cursed the land, that her nightly weeping drew angels to mourn and demons to punish. The clergy hastened to suppress such talk, yet the whispers persisted. Every misfortune was linked to her shadow. Inside her chamber, time thickened. The air smelled of beeswax and incense. The curtains remained closed even in summer. The only sounds were the ticking of a brass clock and the distant toll of church bells across the Rhine Valley. Sometimes, she ordered her attendants to open the windows, only to command them shut again minutes later, murmuring, "The wind speaks lies." Her confessor continued to visit, though his counsel grew increasingly formulaic. He reminded her of obedience, of suffering as sanctification. But she had grown weary of sermons. "Do not speak of heaven," she told him once. "It is too far." There were nights when clarity returned, cruelly brief. She would ask after her children, recall verses from childhood, even smile faintly at the memory of her mother. The next morning, she would not recognize the same people she had spoken to. These oscillations between lucidity and confusion exhausted everyone around her. Physicians prescribed pilgrimages she could not undertake, then purges and bleedings she could barely survive. Holy relics were brought to her bedside, bones of saints, fragments of veils, as if faith could be administered like medicine. Nothing changed. Her illness had become a still lake, no storms, no waves, just an endless reflection of sorrow. Outside, the duchy continued its slow descent into division. The Duke's policies satisfied no one. Protestants accused him of cowardice. Catholics called him a heretic. Rebellion simmered. The Rhine trade faltered, villages quarreled, and the ducal coffers dwindled. Yet in the palace, all seemed frozen. Maria, the symbol of a fading age, embodied the duchy's paralysis, too devout to move forward, too broken to command. In rare correspondence with Vienna, officials described her condition diplomatically. Her Highness remains withdrawn, but serene. It was the language of concealment, a way to preserve dignity in decay. The empire preferred silence to scandal. In truth, serenity was a mask. Those who saw her privately spoke of strange moments, her sudden laughter at nothing, her insistence that unseen visitors attended her prayers, her refusal to sleep in darkness because the saints speak clearer when the candle burns. And yet, despite the fragments of madness, there were glimpses of enduring grace. A servant recalled finding her one evening in the courtyard, watching snow fall under torchlight. When asked if she wished to return inside, she said softly, "No, for once, everything is quiet. And the sky looks like mercy." That fleeting stillness was the last trace of peace she would ever know. The duchy she embodied continued to fracture just as she had, its faiths warring, its heirs quarreling, its soul uncertain. And behind its crumbling unity stood the pale figure of its duchess, her heart and her homeland breaking in unison, one silent prayer at a time. By the 1570s, Maria of Austria no longer belonged entirely to the living world. Those who served her said she moved as one walking through a dream that never ends. The duchess who had once embodied dynastic grace now existed as a shadow of the Habsburg line. Pale, diminished, yet still draped in the dignity that centuries of empire had bred into her bones. The court referred to her quietly as the Lady of the Upper Wing. Few saw her directly anymore. She lived apart from the noise of politics, confined within a handful of candlelit rooms overlooking the Rhine. Her attendants, mostly older women and nuns assigned by the local convent, spoke of her with both pity and awe. They said her presence changed the air, that the light seemed to fade when she entered, as if the sun itself deferred to her sorrow. Her decline had become ritualized. Each morning she was dressed by two maids in heavy black velvet, her hair braided beneath a veil. She would sit by the window for hours, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the frost. Sometimes she murmured prayers in Latin. Sometimes she hummed the same hymn her mother once sang in Prague. But more often, she simply stared, not at the horizon, but at something closer, invisible, just beyond the edge of sight. Her attendants began to fear that she could sense things they could not. One maid swore that she had seen the Duchess pause mid-prayer and turn her head as if listening to a distant voice. "Do you hear it?" Maria asked her once. The girl, trembling, shook her head. "Then it is not for you," Maria replied, and continued praying. By now, her husband, William, had all but abandoned the pretense of companionship. His affairs, both political and personal, took him across the Rhineland. When he returned, it was to consult advisors, not to visit his wife. The few times he did appear at her door, the meetings were brief and ceremonial. He asked after her health. She answered with perfect formality, as if reading from a script learned long ago. Yet despite her obscurity, Maria's name retained an odd power. The Habsburgs were a family steeped in myth, a dynasty that believed blood carried both divine favor and divine punishment. Madness, deformity, and melancholy had long haunted its branches, passed down like a secret curse whispered from cradle to cradle. In Maria, that legacy seemed distilled to its purest form. She holds herself like an empress, one priest wrote. Even when she forgets who she is. Vienna received regular reports about her condition, but little more. Her siblings, now rulers, cardinals, and queens, had lives too burdened with statecraft to make room for her tragedy. In a family obsessed with strength, Maria's fragility was a humiliation best forgotten. The Habsburgs would not exile her to a convent, for that would invite rumor, nor would they recall her to Vienna, for that would display her ruin. Instead, she was left to fade in private, preserved, contained, and invisible. Her isolation became legend among the servants. They whispered that she could not die because the Habsburg blood refused to release its own. They crossed themselves when passing her chamber, saying her shadow sometimes appeared before her body did. A young scribe sent from Cologne later wrote, "The Duchess walks like a relic come to life. She blesses the air when she breathes." The Duchess herself seemed aware of her own spectral status. In moments of lucidity, she spoke of death not with fear, but with weary curiosity. "It must be like a quiet corridor," she once told her chaplain, "one that leads home." Then, after a pause, "But perhaps I am already walking it?" Those brief intervals of clarity revealed the woman she had once been. Intelligent, disciplined, profoundly self-aware. Yet the next moment, she might forget her own name, asking her attendants why the emperor had not summoned her to court. When told that the emperor was her brother and had long since died, she simply nodded and whispered, "Then I am alone indeed." Her son John William visited her rarely, but with genuine affection. He brought her letters and music, hoping to stir memory. Sometimes she smiled, mistaking him for her father Ferdinand. Other times she turned away, murmuring, "You are not mine." The tragedy of inheritance was already unfolding. For John William, though outwardly capable, carried the same shadow within him. He too would descend into madness, repeating his mother's sorrow like a curse echoing through generations. By now, Maria's body mirrored her spirit, thin, translucent, fragile as old parchment. Her hands trembled when she held her rosary. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as if she feared the floor might crumble. The physicians had long ceased prescribing remedies. "Her ailment," one wrote, "is not of the humors, but of the heavens." The servants grew superstitious. They avoided meeting her gaze directly, believing her eyes could see their sins. When she passed through the chapel, they knelt instinctively, not from respect, but from unease. Her presence felt less human than sacred, like a statue that might begin to speak. Outside the palace, the Rhine flowed steadily past the town, a reminder of time's indifference. Merchants came and went, armies marched, treaties shifted. But within those stone walls, Maria's life had slowed to the rhythm of her heartbeat and the tolling of distant bells. She existed between pulse and prayer, a living echo of a name that no longer carried meaning. In her final winters at Dusseldorf, the snow gathered thick upon the windowsills. Her attendants often found her standing motionless, watching it fall. "The sky is remembering," she said once, "and I am what it remembers." To the world beyond her walls, she was already a ghost, a relic of empire, a silent proof of how power could consume its own children. Yet within her fading consciousness, Maria of Austria still carried the dignity of her birth. Even stripped of reason, she never lost her grace. She curtsied before priests who pitied her, thanked servants who feared her, and crossed herself before every candle as if each flame were the last light she might ever see. And so, while the Habsburg courts recorded her only as a distant relative gone unwell in the darkened chambers of the Rhineland, her legend took on a quieter, stranger beauty. The ghost of a dynasty that refused to die, moving through the corridors of memory in the fragile form of one forgotten woman. By 1581, the long decay of Maria of Austria's life reached its final, fragile chapter. She had spent decades drifting between lucidity and delirium, between devotion and despair. And by now, both her body and mind were threadbare. The Duke's physicians described her condition with the clinical detachment of men accustomed to failure. "Her grace is afflicted with tremors of the limbs and the vapors of melancholy." What they meant was that the Duchess, once the radiant daughter of an emperor, had withered into something spectral. Her skin was translucent, her hair turned to fine silver, her eyes unmoored from the present. Her husband, William the Rich, was still alive, still governing, though by then his influence had waned with age and politics. The duchy he had fought to balance was crumbling. Factions divided his court, and his own son's instability foreshadowed ruin. Yet amid the noise of political decay, Maria's existence had become almost mythic, a reminder of the old world, the devout, suffering Habsburg spirit that no reform or rebellion could quite erase. That winter, she was moved to Hambach Castle, a quieter, more remote residence nestled among the wooded hills of the Rhine. The move was meant for her health, or perhaps her concealment. There, surrounded by mist and pine, she spent her final months in near total silence. Her attendants reported that she seldom spoke now, though she still prayed. At times, she appeared to recognize her daughters, but more often she confused them with angels, calling them by names from her childhood. The castle itself seemed to absorb her decline. Its corridors were narrow, its stones damp with winter chill. The servants carried warm bricks wrapped in cloth to her bedside to keep her hands from stiffening. She rarely left her chamber. When she did, she moved slowly, leaning on the arm of her confessor. "The air feels heavier," she told him once, "as though heaven has drawn closer." There were days when she sat by the window for hours, staring at the same patch of forest, lips moving soundlessly. Sometimes she smiled at nothing. Sometimes she flinched at invisible things. The maids, frightened, began crossing themselves whenever they entered her room. "She is half here, half beyond," one wrote. "When she looks at you, it is as if she sees through time." Her confessor, a Jesuit from Cologne, kept a record of her final months. His notes, preserved in fragments, describe a woman already rehearsing her death. She refused to eat meat, claiming that fasting brought her closer to God. She spent entire nights kneeling before the crucifix, even when her legs could no longer hold her weight. "The Duchess lives among the dead," he wrote. "Her prayers are not petitions, but farewells." Her family in Vienna sent letters, formal, cautious, expressions of sympathy written in the language of duty. None came in person. The Habsburgs, engaged in their endless empire building, preferred to let her fade quietly rather than remind Europe of their hereditary frailties. It was easier to bury her in silence than to explain her suffering. In early December, a fever took hold. The confessor wrote that she began speaking of her parents, Emperor Ferdinand and Queen Anna, as if they were in the room. She asked that candles be lit at all hours so that they might find their way to me. The attending physician, unwilling to contradict her, ordered extra candles from the chapel stores. The castle glowed with a soft, eerie light, flickering against the snow outside. On the 10th night of her illness, she became restless. Witnesses said she tried to rise from her bed, insisting that she must prepare for a journey. "They are calling," she whispered. When her attendants asked who, she smiled faintly and replied, "The ones who remember me." After that, she lay back against the pillows, then fell into a fitful sleep, her breathing shallow and uneven. At dawn on December 11, 1581, the bells of Habsburg tolled for morning mass. As they rang, Maria of Austria exhaled her final breath. She was 50 years old. Her confessor recorded her passing simply, "The Duchess departed in quiet grace, as one already accustomed to eternity." There was no grand funeral, no public mourning. The Duke, absorbed in affairs of state, ordered that she be buried swiftly and modestly in the family crypt at Cleve. No monument was raised in her honor. Her death was noted in the ducal records in a single line. Her Grace Maria of Austria, consort of William, departed this life in Habsburg, the 11th day of December. The servants who had cared for her wept in private. To them, she had been both burden and blessing. A woman so gentle that even in madness she never spoke cruelly, so devout that her suffering seemed to sanctify the very rooms she inhabited. When they closed the heavy doors of her chamber for the last time, they said the air felt suddenly lighter, as though the sorrow that had lingered there for decades had at last exhaled. In the weeks that followed, snow covered the roads to Habsburg. The castle fell silent. The Duke never returned there. The candles she had ordered to be lit were allowed to burn down to their ends, their wax pooling on the stone floor like tears. No portraits were commissioned to commemorate her. No poets wrote elegies. The chronicles of the time barely mention her, save as a footnote in the lineage of an empire. But among those who had seen her, the nuns, the maids, the confessor, her memory remained luminous. They spoke of her in hushed tones, calling her the pale saint of Habsburg, the woman who died not of sickness, but of sorrow too long endured. Outside, winter melted into spring, and the Rhine carried its waters past the valley below, indifferent, eternal. Beneath its frozen sky, Maria of Austria, daughter of a holy Roman emperor and duchess of a fractured land, lay beneath stone, her silence at last unbroken. The court moved on. History forgot her name. But for those few who had watched her fade, the memory of her final calm lingered like a prayer, not of glory, but of release. When Maria of Austria died that cold December morning in 1581, there were no proclamations, no royal mourning decrees, no echoes across the empire her father once ruled. Her death was like a candle being snuffed in an empty hall, quiet, final, and almost unobserved. Within days, her name began to dissolve from memory, like ink fading in water. Even the priests who buried her at Cleve did so without ceremony. A few candles, a Latin prayer, and then the stone slab was sealed. For a woman born in the lineage of emperors, her departure was astonishingly small. In Vienna, the news of her death reached the Habsburg court weeks later, folded within a diplomatic letter. Her brother Maximilian II, now aging and burdened with politics, merely nodded upon hearing it. He murmured a brief prayer and returned to his council. To him, it was not cruelty but necessity. The empire allowed no time for grief. Maria had been lost to madness long before she was lost to life. Her absence had become routine. And so, history began its slow erasure. Chroniclers who once listed every marriage and coronation of the Habsburg line mentioned her only in passing. Maria, married to William, Duke of Jülich-Klevsburg, deceased. The court artists who had painted her wedding portrait replaced her likeness with that of new duchesses, new alliances. Within a generation, her image had disappeared from the galleries entirely. Even in the duchy she had lived in for decades, her memory became spectral. The palace at Dusseldorf was refurnished, her apartments reassigned to minor nobles. The servants who had known her were dismissed or died. When later generations walked the corridors where she had prayed and wept, they did not know whose shadow lingered there. Yet the silence that followed her death was not emptiness. It was erasure. The empire had no desire to remember its fractured daughter. Madness was a family embarrassment, a reminder that divine blood could decay like any mortal flesh. For the Habsburgs, history was a mirror polished to perfection. Maria's reflection did not fit. Her husband, Duke William, survived her by nearly a decade. He continued to rule, though his influence waned. There is no record of him speaking her name again after her death. When he died in 1592, he was buried beside her at Cleve, though no marker joined their graves. Their son, John William, the one she had brought into the world through so much pain, inherited both their throne and their torment. John William's reign was brief and tragic. Like his mother, he descended into mental instability. He raged at invisible enemies, shouted prayers through the night, and forbade anyone to speak of death in his presence. The court physicians called it the family illness. He died childless and insane in 1609, leaving no heir to continue the line. With him ended the independent duchy of Jülich-Klevsburg, a region that had once been a jewel in the Rhineland, now fractured and contested by neighbors. It was as though Maria's madness had outlived her, spilling from her body into the fate of her descendants. The duchy's collapse mirrored the decay of her mind. Confusion, division, and silence. What she had carried in her blood, the land inherited in its soil. Her tomb, if it could be called that, was forgotten. Centuries later, scholars searching the crypts beneath Cleve Cathedral found only scattered bones and eroded inscriptions. The marble slabs that once marked noble burials had been worn smooth by time and moisture. No one could say which of the nameless remains had belonged to the Duchess of Austria. The empire that had once recorded every heartbeat of her life had let her bones vanish into dust. And yet, even erasure leaves a trace. In rare manuscripts kept in monastic archives, her name reappears in the margins of letters, in the prayers of confessors who once tended to her soul. One wrote, "She suffered much and spoke little. Her silence was purer than most sermons." Another, "Her faith consumed her reason, and in that fire she was made holy." Those fragments, scattered like shards of broken glass, are all that remain of her humanity. The rest, the laughter of her youth, the warmth of her mother's voice, the sound of her footsteps in the chapel, vanished utterly. The world that had once revolved around divine lineage moved on. The Renaissance turned into the Baroque. New empires rose and fell. The Habsburgs expanded, intermarried, crowned kings and queens, lost wars, and made peace. But not one of them would speak of Maria. She became what every dynasty fears most, not a scandal, but a silence. Yet silence, in time, can speak louder than any chronicle. For those who looked closely, traces of her still flickered through the Habsburg bloodline. the haunted eyes of later rulers, the nervous breakdowns of future heirs, the recurring melancholy that ran through centuries of royal portraits. All of them carried a faint echo of the woman who had prayed herself into oblivion. In Cleve, there were still stories whispered by locals that on cold winter nights, a veiled woman could be seen wandering the ruins of the old ducal chapel, carrying a candle that never burned down. They called her the Duchess who prays for the living. Some said she appeared before wars or floods, others that she visited only when forgotten souls called her name in dreams. It was superstition, perhaps. But in superstition, there is sometimes memory. Maria of Austria's life did not end with grandeur. It dissolved into stillness. But her vanishing was not complete. In the quiet places of Europe's forgotten cathedrals, in the empty spaces of family trees, and in the haunted inheritance of a dynasty built on silence, her presence lingers, a reminder that even in the greatest of empires, the cost of power is not always rebellion or death, but disappearance. The world forgot her name, but the silence she left behind never truly ended. Maria of Austria was never a queen, nor a martyr, nor even a legend. She was something smaller, and therefore more tragic. A woman crushed not by hatred, but by the slow weight of obedience. Her life had been designed to serve an empire. Yet it ended in a locked room where no one came. History, impatient with sorrow that makes no spectacle, moved on without her. But in that silence lies a truth that endures beyond dynasties. That power can imprison the soul more deeply than any wall. And that madness is sometimes the final language of those whom duty has silenced. She left no speeches, no monuments, no airs of peace. Only a whisper that still seems to breathe through the stone corridors of Cleve. I obeyed everything, and yet I disappeared. For the Habsburgs, she was a forgotten footnote. For the world she never saw beyond her window, she remains a quiet question. How many souls were lost not to sin or war, but to the cruelty of silence itself?